My grandson Eli turned 5 on a Saturday in late October. The house was full of noise and color, balloons tied to every chair, a chocolate cake shaped like a fire truck sitting in the center of the table, little children running through the hallway with frosting on their fingers. I had baked the cake myself. I had driven 40 minutes each way to buy the exact candles Eli had pointed at in a store 3 weeks earlier. I was standing near the back door, watching him laugh, when my daughter-in-law Renee walked over to me. She was smiling. That smile should have warned me. It was too calm, too practiced. She leaned in close, the way a person does when they want to appear polite, and she said it quietly but clearly enough for the people standing nearby to hear every single word. "You're not welcome around my kids anymore, Patrice." She said it just like that. No warning. No build-up. No argument before it. Just a sentence delivered like she had been rehearsing it for weeks. I felt the air leave the room, or maybe just leave my lungs. My son Gavin was standing 5 feet away. He heard every word. He looked at me, then looked away. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there, and my hand moved slowly to my purse, where an envelope sat at the bottom. It suddenly felt heavier than it had all morning. Renee didn't stop at one sentence. She kept going, and her voice stayed perfectly even the whole time, which was the part that frightened me most. She turned slightly toward the other guests, her sister, her mother, 2 neighbors I had met only once, and she began to explain. She said I had been overstepping boundaries. She said I showed up too often without asking. She said I made the children anxious. She spoke carefully, with the kind of calm a person uses when they have planned every word in advance. And my son Gavin stood beside her and nodded. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he say, "Maybe we should talk about this privately." He just nodded, like the 2 of them had rehearsed this together in their living room the night before. That was the moment I understood. This was not an emotional outburst. Renee had not woken up that morning and decided on impulse to humiliate me in front of a room full of people at my own grandson's birthday party. This was a plan. Something had been building for a long time, and today was the day they had chosen to make it official and public. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the kitchen pretended to look for something in her purse. I recognized the look on their faces. They didn't know where to look. Neither did I. I didn't argue. I decided in that moment, standing in that bright, noisy room with cake on the table and children running past my legs, that I was not going to give Renee what she was waiting for. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to raise my voice, or cry, or say something she could use later. I had seen it before, that particular stillness in a person right before they expect an explosion. So I did the opposite. I quietly picked up my purse. I said goodbye to Eli, who didn't understand what had just happened. I kissed his forehead and told him I loved him. Then I walked toward the front door. As I reached for the handle, I heard Renee's voice behind me, low but close enough to catch. She was speaking to someone, or maybe to no one in particular, and she said one word. "Finally." That word stayed with me the entire drive home. It didn't sound like relief. It didn't sound like someone who had just done something difficult. It sounded like someone who had just completed the last step of something they had been working on for a long time. One word. But it told me everything I needed to know. This had not started today. This had been building in the dark for months, and today was only the part they had decided to let me see. I got home at noon. The house felt different when I walked in. Too quiet, too still. I sat down at the kitchen table without taking off my coat. I don't know how long I sat there. At some point I got up and walked to the hallway where I kept old photo albums on the bottom shelf. I pulled out 3 of them and brought them back to the table. There was Gavin at age 7, missing both front teeth, holding Eli's older sister Nina the day she came home from the hospital. There was a photo from 2 Christmases ago, me and both grandchildren in matching pajamas that I had ordered in September and wrapped carefully in red paper. There were pictures from school plays, from Sunday lunches, from the time I stayed at their house for 9 days straight when Renee had her appendix out and couldn't lift anything heavier than a glass of water. 9 days. I cooked every meal. I did every school run. I handled both children through nightmares and homework and tantrums without a single complaint. I looked at those photos for a long time. I wasn't just a grandmother who visited on holidays. I had been woven into those children's lives in 100 small and necessary ways. And now, with one sentence at a birthday party, I had been cut out like a thread that was no longer needed. Once I was calmer, I started to think clearly. And when I thought clearly, I began to see the pattern. It hadn't started at the party. It had started at least a year before that, maybe longer. I just hadn't given it a name. The visits had become less frequent without any real explanation. When I called to ask about coming over, Renee would say they were busy, or the kids were tired, or there was something going on that weekend. It was never a flat refusal. It was always something reasonable sounding. Then there were the Christmas and Easter visits where I was welcomed but kept at arm's length. Conversations kept short, goodbyes rushed, the children steered away from me before I was ready to leave. I had told myself I was imagining it. I had told myself that young families were busy, that Renee had her own way of doing things, that I needed to give them space. But sitting at my kitchen table with those photo albums open in front of me, I stopped making excuses for what I had been watching happen for over a year. It had been deliberate. The distance had been managed. The access to my grandchildren had been reduced slowly and carefully. Not all at once, which would have caused a fight, but in small enough steps that I kept adjusting and accepting. They had been phasing me out. And the birthday party was only the door being closed at the end. I gave myself 2 days before I called Gavin. I didn't want to call while I was still raw. I wanted to be steady. I wanted to say the right things and ask the right questions and give him a fair chance to explain what had happened at the party. I rehearsed what I was going to say. I told myself that Gavin was still my son, that there could be things happening in his marriage that I didn't fully understand, that maybe there was a path forward if I could just hear him out. So I called on Monday evening. He answered on the second ring. His voice was flat right from the start. Not cold exactly, but careful, like someone choosing their words off a prepared list. I told him what I had felt at the party. I told him I wanted to understand. I asked him if there was something I had done that I wasn't aware of, something we could talk through together. There was a pause. And then he said it. "It's better this way, Mom." That was all. Not Renee thinks it's better. Not we feel like this is best for now. Just it's better this way. As though he had already decided and the deciding was over and this conversation was only a formality. That small word, it, told me everything. The decision wasn't being made for him. He had made it too. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and tried to work backward through everything I knew. Every conversation, every visit, every strange silence over the past year. And then I remembered something. 6 months earlier in April, I had been looking for a property insurance document in my home filing cabinet when I found a paper I didn't recognize. It was tucked between 2 folders, slightly out of place, the kind of thing that looked ordinary at first glance but didn't match anything I had filed. I had pulled it out slowly, the way you pull out something you're not sure you want to see. It was a loan document. A formal one, with a bank's letterhead, a reference number, a list of terms. And near the bottom, in a section I had to read 3 times before I believed what I was seeing, was my home address. My house. Used as collateral. I had not signed any loan document. I had not been asked to. I had not been told that my son needed financing badly enough to use my house as backing. But there it was in print, attached to a loan in Gavin and Renee's names. I had put the document back. I had closed the cabinet. I had gone to the kitchen and made tea I didn't drink. And then I had started being very, very careful about what I said and what I let on that I knew. I didn't confront Gavin about the loan document right away. I want to be honest about that, because some people would have. But I had lived long enough to know that confronting someone with a single piece of paper, before you understand the full picture, usually only gives the other person time to build their defense. So I held on to it. Over the following weeks, I went back through my own financial records carefully. I checked every document I had ever signed, every account tied to my name, every property paper I owned. And what I found was more than one loan document. There were letters from a mortgage company. Not just inquiries, but actual correspondence referring to arrangements that included my property. There was a refinancing summary with terms I had never agreed to. There were references to a line of credit that appeared to use my home's equity as part of its structure. Each piece on its own might have seemed like a misunderstanding or a clerical error, but together, laid out on my dining room table over 3 evenings in April and May, they painted a picture that was impossible to explain away as an accident. My son and his wife had built a financial structure that depended heavily on what I owned, and they had done it without sitting down and telling me the truth about what they were doing. I am not a financial expert. I never have been. I worked as a school librarian for 22 years, and before that I raised Gavin largely on my own after his father left when Gavin was 9. I knew how to stretch a budget, how to save slowly, how to protect what little we had. I had paid off my house 12 years ago. It was the one thing I owned completely and without question. So when I spread those documents across my dining room table and began going through them, I needed help understanding exactly what I was reading. I called a woman from my church, Bernadette, who had worked in accounting for 30 years before she retired. She came over on a Wednesday afternoon. She sat with me for 4 hours, going through every page, and by the time she left, her expression said more than her words. She told me to call a lawyer. She said it gently, but she said it twice, which meant she was serious. She also pointed out something I had not noticed until she showed me. Several of the documents had Renee's signature as the primary contact and managing party. Not Gavin's. Renee's. She had been the one managing the financial side. She had been the one making the arrangements. And she had done it all while smiling at me across holiday dinner tables and letting me babysit her children every time it was convenient. I want to explain why I stayed quiet for 6 months after finding those documents. It is something I have thought about a great deal, and I don't want anyone to mistake my silence for weakness or fear. I was not afraid of Renee. I was not intimidated by my son's coldness. What I was, and I can say this plainly, was strategic. I had one chance to handle this correctly. If I walked into their house waving loan papers and demanding answers, one of 2 things would happen. Either they would deny everything and move the conversation to my behavior, my emotions, my reliability, or they would panic and take actions, legal, financial, or otherwise, that would make my situation worse before I had protected myself. Neither of those outcomes helped me. So I kept my face neutral at every Sunday visit. I kept my voice warm on every phone call. I brought the children gifts and asked about their school days and said nothing that let on what I had found and what I was quietly doing about it. I needed proof that was solid. I needed advice that was professional. And I needed time to make sure that when the truth finally came out, it came out in a way that I controlled, not in a way that left me standing alone with nothing but anger and no ground to stand on. The birthday party gave me the final piece of the puzzle. Not the documents. I already had those. What the party gave me was the reason. Up until that Saturday, I had been asking myself the same question over and over. Why now? The loan documents had been in place for months. Whatever arrangement Gavin and Renee had built around my property had already been running. So why had they chosen this particular time to cut me off? Sitting at home that night with Eli's laughter still echoing faintly in my memory, the answer became very clear. The bank had been getting closer. Letters were becoming more urgent. The investigation that Bernadette had quietly warned me was likely coming had probably started moving. And Renee, who was smart, far smarter than people gave her credit for, had realized something important. If the bank began asking questions and those questions eventually reached me, I would talk. Not out of revenge. Simply because I had always believed in telling the truth. She didn't ban me because of boundaries. She had never really cared about boundaries. She banned me because she needed distance between herself and the one person who had the most to lose and the most to say. She was clearing the board before the game got dangerous. She just didn't know I had already made my first move. In May, 2 months after I found the first document, I called a lawyer. His name was Terence Okafor, and a neighbor had recommended him after her own property dispute the previous year. I drove to his office on a Tuesday morning, parked in the small lot behind his building, and walked in with a folder of photocopied documents under my arm. I sat down across from him and told him everything. He listened without interrupting. He asked careful questions. He asked for specific dates, specific amounts, specific names. Then he went quiet for a moment and looked at the documents again. When he looked up, his expression was measured but serious. He told me that what I was describing, a property used as loan collateral without the owner's full, informed, documented consent, was not a gray area. He used the word fraud once, carefully, and then explained what that meant in practical terms. He told me that if the loan defaulted, the bank's first line of recovery would be the collateral, which was my house. Without legal intervention, I could find myself facing foreclosure proceedings on a home I had spent my entire working life paying for, because of a debt I had never agreed to carry. He advised me to act quickly. I told him I needed a little more time. He looked at me steadily and asked me why. I told him I wanted the truth to come out in the open. He nodded slowly, like a man who had heard that before. Terence and I worked together over the following weeks. He filed paperwork on my behalf to formally challenge the use of my property as collateral. He sent letters to the bank, alerting them that the property owner, me, had not provided documented, informed consent, and that the arrangement required review. He also helped me protect my other assets, a small savings account, a retirement fund, a piece of land I had inherited from my own mother years ago. The bank responded within 3 weeks. They acknowledged receipt of the legal challenge and indicated that a review process had been opened. Terence explained to me that this was standard language, but that it meant the bank was now aware there was a dispute. That dispute, he said, was now on record. One evening after a long call with him, I sat at the kitchen table with my cup of tea and thought about what I had set in motion. I had not done it out of anger. I want to be very clear about that. I had done it because my home was the one thing I had built slowly and carefully over decades, and no one, not my son, not his wife, not anyone, had the right to use it without my knowledge and risk it without my permission. What had been done to me was wrong. And I had decided, quietly and without drama, to make that wrongness visible before it swallowed me whole. 3 weeks after the birthday party, I received a message from Gavin. Not a phone call, a message, which already told me something. People who are confident in what they are saying call. People who have written something out carefully and need it to sound a specific way send messages. It said that the family wanted to have dinner together, to talk things through. He used those exact words. The message had Renee's phrasing in every sentence. I could hear her voice in the word choices, the careful framing, the way the dinner was described as an opportunity rather than an obligation. I read it twice and then set my phone face down on the table. I knew exactly what that dinner was. It was not a conversation. It was not a genuine attempt at reconciliation. It was a setup, a controlled environment where they expected me to arrive feeling guilty, feeling small, and ready to either apologize for imaginary offenses or accept whatever terms they placed in front of me. And they were counting on my love for my grandchildren to make me desperate enough to agree to anything just to get access back. What they didn't know, couldn't have known, was that I had spent 6 months becoming someone who was no longer desperate. I replied simply that I would come. And I made one quiet phone call to Terence the following morning. The dinner was at Gavin and Renee's house on a Friday evening. I arrived at 6 o'clock, exactly when the message had said, and I brought nothing with me except my handbag and the folder I had been preparing for weeks. I had rehearsed my breathing on the drive over. Not my words. I had moved past the need to rehearse words. Just my breathing. Because I knew that the only thing that could undo everything I had worked toward was if I let emotion run ahead of clarity. The house smelled like roasted chicken. Renee was in the kitchen when I arrived, and she came to greet me with a smile that looked completely normal. That was the thing about Renee, she was always composed. She wore it like armor, that composure. Gavin kissed my cheek and offered me a drink. The children were already in bed, which I had expected. This was not a dinner for the children. This was for the adults, and the children had been deliberately kept out of it. I sat at the table that I had sat at dozens of times before, in the same chair I usually used, and I folded my hands on the surface and waited. Renee's mother was there too, I noticed, sitting at the far end of the table, quiet, watching. That told me they had wanted a witness of their own. So had I, in a different way. Renee began speaking about 10 minutes into the meal. She had let the food be served, let small talk fill the first few minutes, and then she set down her fork and shifted her posture in that precise way she had. the way that meant she was done with the warmth portion of the evening. She began listing things. Each one was framed as a specific example of my overstepping. She said I had shown up unannounced too many times. She said I had contradicted her parenting decisions in front of the children. She said I had created tension in the household by being too involved. Each point was delivered calmly, with a specific memory attached to it, a real event pulled slightly out of context and placed inside a frame that made me look like a problem to be managed. What struck me was how organized it was. These were not complaints born of genuine hurt. They were talking points. They were a list someone had built over time, adding to it whenever a moment could be reframed to support the conclusion they had already decided on. Gavin backed her up at each point, adding a detail here, confirming a date there. I watched him and felt a kind of grief I hadn't expected, not because I was angry, but because I could see how completely he had chosen. Not because she was right, but because going along was easier than standing in the middle. He looked at the table more than he looked at me. Then Renee said the word that made everything stop. She had been building toward it. I could feel it the way you feel a weather change before the sky actually turns. She straightened, looked at me directly, and said, "We think it's best that you step back permanently." Permanently. Not for now. Not for a while. Permanently. I looked at her. Then I looked at Gavin. He was studying the pattern on the tablecloth. Renee's mother sat very still at the end of the table. The word hung in the air above the plates and the half-eaten chicken and the glasses of water nobody was drinking anymore. I had expected something like this. I had told myself I was prepared for it. But there is a difference between preparing for a word and actually hearing it, permanently, in the voice of someone who is speaking about your grandchildren. About Eli, who had just turned 5 and still ran to hug my legs when I came through the door. About Nina, who called me every Sunday evening to tell me one thing she had learned that week at school. I felt the weight of it settle. And then I felt something else move through me, something steady and calm, the thing that had been building for 6 months, the thing I had worked for and protected and carried carefully through every quiet moment since April. I reached into my handbag. I placed the folder on the table. I didn't slam it. I didn't push it dramatically toward them. I simply set it down, flat and quiet, between my plate and the centerpiece. A small thing, maybe half an inch thick, held closed with a plain rubber band. Renee's eyes went to it immediately. So did Gavin's. Renee's composure held for about 3 seconds, and then I watched something shift slightly behind her eyes. She didn't know exactly what was in that folder. But she knew something was wrong. She recognized, in the way that people who have been hiding something always recognize, that whatever was inside that folder had something to do with what they had been hiding. Gavin leaned forward very slightly. He was trying to read the label on the tab, I think. His face had gone still in a different way than before. Not the practiced stillness of someone following a plan, but the real stillness of someone who has just realized the plan had a problem they hadn't accounted for. Renee's mother looked from the folder to me and back to the folder. Nobody spoke. The kitchen clock was audible. I kept both hands flat on the table, one on each side of the folder, and I said nothing at all. I let the silence fill the room. I had learned something important over the past 6 months. The right kind of silence is louder than any argument. I opened the folder. I did it slowly, deliberately, and I turned it so that Gavin could see the first page clearly. It was the loan document, the original one I had found in April, the one with the bank's letterhead and the reference number and my home address in the collateral section. I had made 3 copies over the months and kept the original secure. I pointed to the bottom section, to the line where my address appeared, and I looked at my son. I said, quietly and clearly, "Your name is here. And mine is here." But I was never asked. Gavin's face changed in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager caught in a lie, that specific expression where the defense and the guilt and the calculation of what to say next all happen at the same time on one face. His color went. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Renee did not look at the document. She looked at me, and for the first time that evening, her composure slipped. Not completely, she was too controlled for that, but something went out of her face. The confidence. That particular quality of certainty that had been in her expression all evening, the assurance of someone who believes they are several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. She had stopped smiling. She was calculating, I could see that. But for the first time, she was calculating from behind. I did not stop at the first page. I turned to the second document, a letter from the mortgage company referencing the equity arrangement. I turned to the third, the refinancing summary. I laid each one out with the same quiet steadiness. Not angry, not rushed. Each page placed with the care of someone who had handled it many times and knew exactly what it said. I spoke as I laid them out. I told Gavin that I had found the first document in April. I told him I had spent time understanding what it meant. I told him that Bernadette, he knew Bernadette, I said, he had met her at church twice, had sat with me and helped me read through everything. I said Terence Okafor's name. I said it without elaboration, without explanation, and I watched Gavin's expression change when he heard it. He knew what a lawyer's name meant in that sentence. I said that I had not come tonight to have a conversation about whether I had overstepped boundaries at birthday parties. I said that what was on the table between us now was a question of something far more serious than that. The room had gone very still. Renee's mother had both hands in her lap and was looking at neither of us. Renee herself had not spoken in several minutes, which was the longest I had ever known her to go without steering a conversation. I let a beat of silence pass, and then I said the rest. I told them that the bank had already contacted me. Not as a result of anything I had done yet. The correspondence had come through the formal legal challenge Terence had filed, which had triggered a review on the bank's end. I said that the bank was now aware that the property owner had not provided documented consent, and that a review process had been opened. Then I said 4 words, they are investigating it. The word investigating landed in that room like something physical. I watched it land on Renee. She sat back, not dramatically, just slightly, the way a person moves when something takes the air out of them. Gavin pushed back from the table. Not to stand up, just to create distance, which was a thing his body had always done when a situation became more than he knew how to hold. His chair scraped against the floor. Renee's mother set down her glass. For a moment, nobody made a sound. This was no longer a family dinner where I was being guided toward an apology. This was a room where the people who had built a plan were looking at the moment their plan had stopped working. I had not raised my voice once. I had not made a single accusation that wasn't backed by a document sitting on the table. And I had not come there to perform anything. I had come because I needed the truth to be said out loud in that room, with witnesses present. Gavin spoke first. He said my name, Mom, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was much younger, before the years and the choices had thickened something between us. It was the voice of someone who has just understood the scale of something and doesn't yet know what to do with that understanding. He started to say something about the loan being temporary, about the intention never being to put me at risk, about how he had meant to explain it but the timing was never right. His voice fractured slightly in the middle of that last sentence. Renee cut in. She tried to redirect. I watched her do it in real time, pivot from defense to reframe, try to pull the conversation back towards something she could manage. She said they had always intended to protect my interests. She said the arrangement had seemed straightforward at the time. She said things had become complicated. But the room was no longer hers. I noticed that small but significant shift. Renee's mother had turned her body slightly away from her daughter and was looking at the documents on the table. Gavin had stopped supporting Renee's talking points. He was still sitting at the table, but he was no longer beside her in the way he had been at the beginning of the evening. He was somewhere in the middle, not yet where he needed to be, but no longer simply agreeing with everything she said. When there was a gap in the noise and the half-formed sentences and the attempts to reframe what could not be reframed, I spoke. My voice was calm. It was the calmest it had been all evening. I said, "You didn't cut me off because I was too involved." I paused just long enough for that to settle. Then I said, "You removed me because I was the only person in this situation who had not been told the truth. And the truth was going to reach me eventually." I looked at Gavin when I said the next part. Not at Renee. At my son. "You didn't just push me away," I said. "You removed the only person who was actually in a position to protect you." What I meant, And what I believe Gavin understood in that moment was this: I had not gone to the bank to destroy them. I had gone to protect myself. But in protecting myself, I had also created the one legal record that acknowledged the arrangement existed and who was responsible for it. Terence had made sure my rights were formally documented. And that documentation, whether they realized it yet, was also the clearest account of what had happened. I was the paper trail. I had not planned to be their undoing. But I had always been their loose end. In the weeks after that dinner, Terence moved forward with full legal authority. The formal challenge to the use of my property was upheld. The bank, having received the dispute documentation and opened its review, began looking much more carefully at the full loan arrangement and the circumstances under which it had been established. I was informed that my home was no longer at risk. The legal process that had been set in motion would take time, but my position was protected. The financial structure that Gavin and Renee had built around my property began to collapse. Not because I pushed it, but because it had been built on something it was never supposed to touch, and once that foundation was formally removed, the rest could not hold its own weight. I did not follow every development closely. Terence handled what needed to be handled, and I trusted him. What I focused on instead was something simpler and more important. I reached out to Nina's school, not to Gavin or Renee, but through a channel that was available to me as a documented family member. I sent Eli a birthday letter, because his birthday had passed in the noise of everything and I hadn't been able to celebrate with him the way I had wanted. I kept the door to myself open. I didn't close it. I didn't lock it. But I also stopped standing in front of it waiting for someone to let me through. Several months have passed since that Friday evening at their dining room table. The house is mine, free and clear, the same as it always should have been. I still have my morning tea at the kitchen table. I still pull out the photo albums sometimes and look at the pictures. Some things have not changed and some things never will. But other things have. Gavin called me in late winter. It was a short call, awkward in the way that calls are when two people are trying to find their way back to something without yet knowing the exact path. We didn't resolve everything that evening. We didn't need to. What mattered was that he called. Nina asked her teacher to send me a drawing she had made, a house with a red roof and a stick figure in the garden labeled Grandma P. Eli has started sending voice messages on Gavin's phone, short and chaotic and full of background noise, the way 5-year-olds talk. I save every one of them. I did not get here by being hard. I did not get here by revenge or anger or bitterness. I got here by being steady when everything around me was designed to make me fall apart. I had been used as a foundation that someone built on without asking. What I learned, slowly and quietly and without anyone seeing it happen, was how to become my own foundation first. They didn't just ban me from their lives. They showed me.